This is Amalgamations, the Contemporary Jewish Artists Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Klaus. I'm here with Suzanne Kosowitz, who is coming to us from Australia, Perth to be specific. Welcome.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
What's it like growing up Jewish in Perth?
It's a small community. There's basically one Jewish school, which is the kind of the hub for the social life in the Jewish community. And then there's about 4 or 5 different shuls, and that's it. And to put that into perspective, Perth is this capital city in a state of Western Australia, which is 3 times the size of Texas. So we've got 4 or 5 shuls for a big plot of land. So it's small. For me, growing up, it's all about the home. And it's all about the Jewish experiences of the family, and that extends to going to shul, that extends to the different chagim that we celebrate, and other connections beyond that. So lots of community fundraising events, and something else that's like very, very prominent in Australia is a really strong sense of Zionism. That's something that unifies us in a country that's so far away from other countries in the world and other epicenters of Jewish life, such as in America, where you are. So that's what it's like growing up Jewish. It's homely, it's family, and that strong connection to Israel.
Let's talk about the music side. So take us back to some of your earliest musical memories, and from there, how did your engagement with music evolve as you got older?
My dad is a huge sound system nerd, and something that we had together was listening to vinyl records, especially Jewish music. And these vinyl records were kept in a cabinet which was made out of jarrah wood. And the smell of this kind of wood is just so intoxicating. There's something that whenever I would open up the cupboards to the vinyl records, you'd have this combination of the vinyl records smell and the jarrah wood. And so that combined together made me think of Kiddush wine. It's almost as if these records had a Jewish smell about them.
It's amazing how much smell is connected with our sense of memory.
Yeah. And it was always after the Shabbos dinner, we'd always listen, it would just be Jewish music. A lot of Hasidut, klezmer, lots of Israeli folk songs. So that's songs that came from the kibbutz and the establishment of the state of Israel. Again, very Zionist songs. And we'd put on the record, and I'd be dancing around, and Dad would be sitting down listening to it, and that was the beginning of just music being this awesome, cool thing. And, the fact that there's this Jewish culture that I can connect to and connect with my dad and all that.
As you got older, clearly you made music your own and decided to pursue it more seriously. So how did that come about?
I started learning to play instrument about year 1. So that was about age 5 or 6. I started with violin, but it wasn't the right instrument for me. Then I went to piano and then just kept adding instruments from there. So what always struck me was this notion of music performance is about recreating something that already exists. And if you think about other art forms such as painting, we don't give primary school students or elementary students in America, we don't just give them, this is Picasso, go and paint this, replicate this as closely as you can, and you'll be assessed on how closely you can replicate this. This is a piece of painting. It's got some cool ideas. Now go do your thing. And so for me growing up, learning piano, then learning guitar, it was strange that we didn't have that creativity element in our education for music. And that's always something that struck me as odd. So I would notice patterns in the pieces that I was playing. It's like, oh, okay, well, this pattern, I've seen this pattern in a few different pieces. So, that means that that's a pattern that I could use and create my own thing.
We've talked about your Jewish self and we've talked about your musical self, starting to get a little bit of a sense of how they've evolved separately. I want to start thinking about how they have evolved in a commingled sort of way and how it led to who you are now. You talk about this idea of an internalized silence about your Jewish identity. What do you mean by that?
It's not so much an internalized silence of my Jewish identity. It's more about an internalized silence of like how I'm allowed to be as a person. And I think it actually has more to do with gender. I had this stark realization moment after my bat mitzvah, which no one told me about before, which is about kol isha elva, which means a woman's voice is akin to nakedness. And what that meant, whilst they didn't say those words exactly, the situation was there was a chazan coming from South Africa to do a concert. And the previous year he had come and I was part of the choir. I got to sing with him. But this time around, what was different was now I was over the age of bat mitzvah, and that meant I couldn't sing in the choir with him. It was just this moment that caught me unaware that now that you're over the age of 12, you can't sing in the company of men. Looking back, that moment probably had a deeper effect on me than I realized at the time.
How did that continue to impact you?
For instance, if I had an opinion, someone would then challenge it. I would go to then defend my position, but then they would talk over me as I was giving that defense. I took it to be the rhetoric behind my argument wasn't strong enough, rather than, oh, maybe the other person should have let me finish first. There was a lot of things that I just accepted were normal rather than going, maybe this isn't such a great way to, treat other humans.
I'm hearing these experiences of yours from the past that maybe were a bit negative, and yet you still compose music that brings in Jewish elements. It almost seems contradictory, and why do you still write Jewish music?
I love what the religion can share and teach us about values of kindness, of justice, and family inclusion. I feel that there's so much in Judaism that is really beautiful and, worthwhile to have. And it gives me that connection to my family and extending beyond that, especially in a country that's like so far away from other countries. I think living in a circumstance where you're somewhat isolated, having a sense of connection and belonging to something is really, really important. And I can see that those elements are there in Judaism, and it's there in the music, it's there in prayers, and I want to uphold that.
Can you talk a little bit about how your experience with your klezmer band Kol Nafshi impacted you and why it was a turning point for you? Now, I know that you started working with them during a period of your life where you weren't composing. Take us through that.
You don't see so many pathways for musicians in Perth. Initially, my thoughts were, okay, I want to go study in America. And I went to a summer festival in 2012 and met like-minded musicians. And this was great. And I was like, I just want to come back. So in the process of trying to get myself to a position where I could afford to go and study abroad, I was doing my honours, which is like a postgraduate 1 year of study. And if you do well, if you get a high distinction, your chances of getting scholarships to study abroad increase. So composition is already this very it's all on you activity. And then on top of that, I added this extra pressure and I just burnt out. And when you burn out, you lose the access to cognitive skills required for creativity. And I needed to put a hold on postgraduate study and just kind of rebuild again. So during this rebuilding, I still wanted to do something music-y. And I am really passionate about klezmer music. I'm passionate about world music. I have this huge library of sheet music at home, which have the melody, the words, the chords, all written out that I can then take with me to my friends, and we can start jamming and creating our own music and creating our own sound. So that's how Kol Nafshi started. Kol Nafshi is Hebrew for my soul's voice. And I think that really, that name really encapsulates what I feel I want to be doing with my music, which is, letting my voice express itself.
Since your hiatus, you've been plenty busy composing. Would certainly love to hear how you came out of this feeling of burnout. And I know that last year you studied with Ken Lampel. Can you talk about why that experience was so pivotal?
For a lot of my life, I felt like I didn't really have someone around me that had pursued the career path that I wanted to pursue. So I've always wanted to have a mentor that can kind of just show me a way. And that's why when I met Ken, it was just such a huge, it's like, oh, fine, I found someone. This is amazing. And he's based in Canberra, which is, if Perth is a small town, Canberra is even smaller. So, and I met Ken because I went back to the States in 2018 for the Mostly Modern Festival. So from that, I met this cellist called Dave Eggar, and he particularly wanted to introduce me to Ken because he was someone that, when playing my piece Dance in Defiance at the Mostly Modern Festival, he just, when I first met him in the rehearsal, he's like, I just love the Jewishness in your music. It's awesome. And so then introducing me to Ken, he's like, she's a Jewish composer. She's amazing. I love her stuff. I really want to introduce her to you. Now I found someone who come from a similar background to me, who is a composer and who's currently based in Australia. Yeah, they're on the other side of the country, but look, we're doing pretty good to find a like-minded person in the same country, in the same hemisphere. We're off to a good start. So that was so pivotal, and it was like someone who could explain music as if music is a sculpture, and that to me made a lot of sense. We were discussing the way we can conceptualize music. And so that really helped me get out of the burnout, because it just came back to how do I as a person see, in inverted commas, see music? How does it make sense to me? How can I describe that? And then how can I build from that?
It's interesting. I think in America, sometimes we take it for granted, the amount of access we have to Jewish music, Jewish musicians. So I'd like to talk about some of your compositions now, and I would love for you to help take us through the chronology of these, specifically which came before and which came after the hiatus that you had, and which came before and which came after your time studying with Ken Lampel. So I would love to talk about Dot, Dance in Defiance, A Light is Sown for the Pious, Eitz Chayim, and Partisans Song.
So the pieces that were before my hiatus were Dot and Dance in Defiance. And these pieces, I didn't intend to be overtly Jewish. I also felt I didn't want to be tokenized as the Jewish composer. And so for me, that point of the amalgamation was using the Frägische scale. And in Dot, I used the Frägische scale in an improvised section near the middle. And that is based off the Jewish form known as the doina. And the doina is an improvised melody over a drone.
You're listening to Dot, as performed by saxophonist Aaron Royer and pianist Ben Powell.
I've always had this affinity between the Frägische scale and improvisation. And so I wanted to include that in the piece for Dot. And so what you see in the score is actually just a box of the notes in the scale. And then the direction is improvise over this.
Composer David Ludwig describes your music as having, quote, vibrant rhythms and ethereal textures. These are certainly evident to me in Dance in Defiance. Now, the program note certainly suggests that you were feeling defiant of something when you wrote it. The piece is based on a passage from Stephen King's novel 11/12/63, which I'd love to read now. For a moment, everything was clear, and when that happens, you see that the world is barely there at all. Don't we all secretly know this? It's a perfectly balanced mechanism of shouts and echoes pretending to be wheels and cogs, a dream clock chiming beneath a mystery glass we call life. Behind it, below it, and around it, chaos, storms. Men with hammers, men with knives, men with guns, women who twist what they cannot dominate and belittle what they cannot understand. A universe of horror and loss surrounding a single lighted stage where mortals dance in defiance of the dark. And then you write on that, when people find themselves encircled by darkness, they must nevertheless continue on their personal journey and dance in defiance of their surroundings. What were you defying?
I guess it's things that at the time I just couldn't put into words. It comes back to that internalized silence. And I was just like, there's a lot of things that I just accepted were, this is the way the world works. And I wasn't particularly happy about it, but I accepted it. I think that's what I was defying. I was just like, need to get this out of me.
For me, the most poignant moment of this piece was about 2/3 of the way through. So we come out of this section that is slow and full of what I would describe as almost a malaise and these otherworldly sounds. Then the energy picks up and we feel this sense of agitation and urgency leading to this sudden moment. You've been listening to Dance in Defiance as performed by the American Modern Ensemble, conducted by Francisco Hernandez Bolaños. Is this your moment of defiance?
The piece begins in very soft tones, and then it's as if the first time the rhythms pick up, the beat picks up, it's like it's that first attempt to defy, and then it kind of gets brought back down saying, nah, we're suppressing this. And then it picks up again as a response of like, being in this, repressed state. And then it's like, actually, you know what? We're going to do this again. We're going to defy this again. We're going to dance again. By the time you get to that point, you've had this foray into that chaotic dance rhythms and, energetic sounds. It got pulled back, but then it re-emerges again. You're going to come across obstacles, and it's not the end.
Is this a Jewish piece?
Sometimes a piece comes to me because I've seen an artwork or I've read something. This one, I had the title first, and that's rare. I don't usually have the title first. So I had Dance in Defiance, and then I'm like, okay, I'm going to do my research, and I'm going to look for instances that have this comment. And one of my resources is going through the Tanakh to see if I can find something in any Jewish scripture, and I couldn't quite find something that really spoke to what I wanted to speak about. So I was, just kept researching. And I came across the Stephen King quote from the novel, and I was like, this is what I'm trying to say. And so I think for this piece, it's a universal story that I wanted to tell. And it didn't need to be overtly Jewish. And then with that fear of tokenism, if it's too Jewish, does that mean that if my audience member isn't Jewish that they can't connect to it? So I never want that to be something that if it's too overtly a certain culture that someone else can't access it. So at that time I was like, yeah, so it's not really a Jewish, it has Jewish sounds in it because that's just part of, my palette of sounds and colors that I paint with music. But it really was this is a story of dance and defiance, and it can be in any context. So no, it's not a Jewish piece, but it has some Jewish sounds in it.
Jewish sounds, and certainly, as you've described, was written with your mind oriented towards what is your place as a Jewish person in the world.
Yeah.
So let's then pivot to talking about three of your pieces that are pretty unequivocally Jewish. And clearly there must have been a transition in your thinking between Dance and Defiance and these three pieces. Now, I believe that Eitz Chayim was the first of those three to be composed. In fact, the first piece you wrote after the hiatus. Is that true?
Yep.
It's a theme and variations for organ on Tanchum Portnoy's famous setting of the Eitz Chayim text. Take a listen. You're listening to Eitz Chayim as performed by organist Austin Philomen.
It's from a friend saying, hey, I want to commission you to write me a piece. And it was hard to write that piece because I still hadn't really fully recovered the cognitive parts of the brain that help with creativity. So I was kind of fighting against that. But this came with a deadline and I really wanted to write this piece. Something that's always stayed with me is I can always come back to Jewish themes and Jewish songs. They asked me to do the commission in like September or early October. I had no idea what I was going to write. And then in late October, there was the shooting at the Pittsburgh synagogue, the Tree of Life synagogue. I saw an interview given by Itzhak Perlman to Stephen Colbert. And Stephen Colbert was asking him, how can you in these such terrible times, how can you play with such joy still? And Itzhak Perlman said something about how, through music you can find the joy. And that's something I think is inherent in Jewish music, is that you always have this, the happy and the sad, the laughter through the tears. So it made me think of the Tree of Life synagogue, and I thought, well, Eitz Chayim, there's this tune for Eitz Chayim. And that's something that I could base this off. And also, for me, the pipe organ is it's a very church instrument. And to me, it made sense that to have a tune that comes from liturgy. It took a really long time. I would sit down and I'd be able to work on it for like half an hour, and then I just needed to run and hide under blankets because it was just, it was hard to know that the mind is just not quite there, but you're determined to write this thing, and especially because of the subject matter that I chose, I felt it was almost a duty. It's like I've got to get this out there. I need this song. And in the program notes, I explain how when tragedy occurs, people turn to their faith and they try to find solace in the prayers, and how hard that is to find that solace, because that's the intention. But to actually reach that point of solace, that's hard. And I wanted to express that kind of journey of like going through something very, very tragic that happens in a house of worship, and then trying to recover from that with the sounds and the words that permeate that house of worship.
So the next piece out of the ones I mentioned that you completed after the hiatus was A Light is Sown for the Pious.
Yeah. It's a setting of another prayer, which is Ana B'Koach, and A Light is Sown for the Pious. The title actually comes from the first verse, which is said in the Kol Nidre service on Yom Kippur. Just the imagery of that, a light is sown for the pious, because when we think of sacred works, it's uplifting, it's looking heavenward, it's, the angels are above us, and it's all about finding that connection to spirituality by looking up. But then you have this sentence that says, a light is sown for the pious. And that really struck me, because during the burnout, it felt like I had to dig deep to find the answers. And so that sentence really resonated with me.
Now, in your program notes, you talk about the idea of anguish of human reality. Then at the end, imagining an individual who finds the strength of their faith again. You've been listening to A Light is Sown for the Pious, as performed by the Mostly Modern Orchestra, conducted by Francisco Hernandez Bolaños. Is this piece autobiographical? And if so, why did you write it?
With my music, a lot of the storytelling is that life is hard and bad things can happen and situations can be dire. But I guess with all these pieces, I want to give the listener a sense of that there's hope, and how hope and beauty can emanate from the same sounds.
Now let's talk about one more piece, which I believe is your most recent one, Partisans Song.
Yeah.
Partisans Song is, as many of our listeners will know, considered one of the chief anthems for Holocaust survivors. The words were written in 1943 by Hirsch Glick, a Jewish inmate of the Vilna Ghetto, in response to the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. His words were set to a pre-war Soviet song by Dmitry and Daniel Pokras. Now, your arrangement also has the lyrics translated into Noongar, the language of the Noongar people, who are an Aboriginal Australian people of the region where Perth is currently located. Obviously, there's a personal connection there, but my understanding is that you were inspired by the Noongar people's connection to the land and saw a parallel to our people's connection to Israel.
Yeah, so this whole project came about with the Upstanders project. So this was a project to combine lots of different artistic resources for educating people about upstanders. And this arrangement was inspired by this fascinating Australian story that I only learnt about last year. And that is when Kristallnacht happened in 1938. the Aboriginal elder William Cooper saw that the Australian government didn't respond to the Kristallnacht attacks. And he waited 3 weeks to see if there would be an official response. And there wasn't one. And so he decided that he was going to collect an array of signatures in protest of what was happening to the Jewish people in Europe. Now, in 1938, the Aboriginal people in Australia had no rights at all. They were still considered flora and fauna right up until 1967. And to me, what was incredible was that he was someone who was oppressed, that had no rights of his own, but still saw the injustices happening on the other side of the world and said, I am going to stand up for these people. And if I can show that I can stand up for the Jewish people, maybe people will see the need to stand up for Aboriginal people. And I was amazed with this story because, I'm born and raised in Australia and I've never heard of this guy. The project was to create a piece for choir using the Partisans Song, but also finding a way to pay homage to William Cooper. My friend Jesse John Flay, who is a Noongar person himself, did the translation of the Partisans Song into Noongar. And then it was my job to take that translation and then set it back to music and to make it sound like the melody of the Partisan Song, because the Noongar language, it doesn't rhyme in the way that Western languages rhyme. And that also leads to the sentence structures and the word structures.
And by bringing these different languages together, as you put it, you hope to reach all people across all cultural divides. And certainly its lyrics are timeless to those experiencing oppression. Let's take a listen. you've been listening to the Partisans Song as performed by the Ellenbrook Secondary College Choir and the Carmel School Choir, directed by Stuart Ryan Davis with pianist Warren Bracken. So in thinking about all of these compositions and all of the compositions of yours that we didn't talk about which aren't Jewish, my question to you is very open-ended. Who are you? What is your identity?
I'm someone that wants to tell stories, and I'm someone that wants people, when they hear these stories, to feel better about themselves, to feel more hopeful in their lives, and have a good time.
What's next?
So I'm currently writing a piece for cello for my friend Dave Egger back in the States. I'm also going to foray of theatre, trying to write some scripts, learning how to write scripts. So just to keep the conversation going, hopefully can keep continuing to share these stories and reaching more people.
Well, thank you so much. If you'd like to learn more about Suzanne, visit her online at SuzanneKosowitz.com. That's SuzanneKosowitz.com. Thanks so much for listening. Our theme song is F Minor Klezmer by the Underscore Orchestra from their album Fancy Cocktails and Hot Sauce. Check them out at theunderscoreorchestra.com. That's orchestra with a K, ORKESTRA. I'm your host, Aaron Klaus, and this has been Amalgamations, the Contemporary Jewish Artists Podcast.